Tackling rivalry week here at the Voice of College Football, as we always do, and we can't forget about this one, Florida State getting it together there in Tallahassee. We got David Waters in line from Gators Breakdown to help us out. David, how's it going?
Pretty good, Mark. Trying to enjoy this Thanksgiving week, but this game took a weird turn. Florida going to Nashville last week and, laying an egg versus Vanderbilt. So we were looking, a week ago, if you would have talked to me, we would have been talking about, hey, Florida State's coming up. These two teams will just get by this week and set up a big matchup. And look, I don't think Florida was necessarily looking ahead here past Vanderbilt toward out Florida State, but that team did not show up. And it, at least on the Florida side, puts a little bit of a damper on this game a bit. So I don't necessarily want to call it desperation. In some ways it is, but, Florida's just got to rebound.
Well, I got to say this, that maybe the only thing losing to Vandy that would be worse than the way you lost to Vandy would have been if you lost the week before, because that was the one that everybody paid attention to across the nation because there were the headlines all over the place. Vandy wins for the first time in 26 SEC games, and Kentucky was kind of the butt of the joke. But then, so everybody took notice of Florida losing to Vandy, but maybe not quite as much because of that.
Also, but in a way, though, it kind of did get noticed because South Carolina goes and beats Tennessee. And then, hey, this is the same South Carolina team that couldn't score a touchdown on offense on Florida the week before. So, Mark, as I've said, the last week has just been so weird. Florida off the big win versus South Carolina just because of, it was a big margin of victory. Florida dominated that game in every form and fashion. And only for a week later, South Carolina to – put together possibly their best offensive performance in program history just a week later of not doing anything against Florida. It's and then it's like, whoa, what did Florida do today? Oh, wow, they lost to Vanderbilt? Really? So, Mark, it was a weird week in college football last week, SEC as well. But just think about the last few weeks in the SEC East. You had South Carolina beating Vanderbilt. Then Vanderbilt beating Kentucky, Florida dominating South Carolina. A week later, Vanderbilt beats Florida. South Carolina ends up, destroying Tennessee. So the SEC East has just been crazy the last couple of weeks.
The mid layer of college football, anything can happen. And what you just outlined over the last 2 weeks definitely defines that to a T. I do rankings every week. I counted up the 7 and 4 teams in college football. There are 22 of them.
Wow.
I told people, just try to rank those 22 teams. Don't even go to anybody else. Just try to rank those 22 teams. It's impossible. So we don't know who's going to beat anyone at this point between those 6 and 5, 7 and 4 level teams. It's just a mishmash. Who's going to show up? That was once famously said by somebody, I think Lou Holtz, that a different team shows up every week. So we don't know.
I mean, every week is a reset. I think we were definitely learning that in college football. Mark, it does kind of follow the theme of this year. Before the season, we had pegged wrongly Alabama, but Alabama, Georgia, Ohio State, Clemson, probably the 4 right there. And a lot of people said behind those 4, 5 through 40, could be, could go either way, week in and week out. And for the most part, you change the top 4. But that is pretty much what we have gotten this year in college football.
All right. So this is Florida State. And for somebody who's completely outside the rivalry, except for to tune it in every year and to think back, 3 and 4 decades and what it means to me, just because I'm so into college football, rivalry week, these all mean something to me. I think it's just cool. It's just unmatched in sports what rivalries are in college football. How important is this game? Because obviously there are no championship implications. The bowl game's secure. What does this really mean?
Yeah, Mark, it's, as I said, because last week's performance for Florida did put a damper on it a little bit. It was setting up to be a bigger matchup than it had been in quite some time. Still that way in some form, but not as big as it was going to be just going back to last Friday, the day before Florida loses to Vanderbilt. But of course, Billy Napier in his first year, it's not a must win in year one, but it could build a lot of goodwill after that loss versus Vanderbilt. And for Mike Norvell, it was in some ways some ways, and it'd be an inexcusable loss with the way they're rolling going into this game. Florida has been up and down a roller coaster right now. Florida State, the only thing you really count against them is that mid-stretch in the middle of the season against it was Wake Forest, NC State, Clemson, where a lot of people, they gave them more of a puncher's chance than they originally did going into that stretch before the season because the way they had started, they beat LSU, and they played okay in those games, but they did go 0-3, but bounced back nice and just dominated since. And then Florida beat Texas A&M, beat South Carolina. It was setting up for a pretty big matchup. But for both both coaches right now, not so important for Billy Napier, except for to build some goodwill with the fan base to end the season after last week, and for Mike Norvell to kind of, hey, look, recruiting is going okay for Florida State. Florida State should be recruiting better. That's just plain and simple. When it's all said and done, they're not recruiting as good as Florida. They're not recruiting as good as Miami. We'll see, if any late season surge here because of what they're doing on the schedule to end the season does anything there. But I don't think it'll do too much. So, I think he could build some goodwill too, just to get the victories on the field and seeing if it could translate on the recruiting trail some form or fashion in the next month or so. So, markets lately, ever since the 90s, it's been kind of a chunk here, a chunk there from either team. It's definitely not what it was in the 90s. Urban Meyer comes in, dominates the series. Jimbo Fisher comes in, dominates the series. Dan Mullen comes in, dominates the series right there. So, we'll see what the future holds, but it's nowhere near what it was in the 90s. This was setting up to be a bigger matchup. And, we'll see what comes out. It is weird that it's going to be on Friday night. A lot of people will be watching on Friday night. It'll be, kind of prime time, all eyes on the matchup. So it'll have that big game feel, but it's not at that national level.
All right, David, there are so many things that you said right there that I'd like to take off on. And I guess one is, as we stand just looking at this particular matchup, Florida State is everything that you just outlined in regards to how their season's gone. They're at a point where I believe I know what I'm going to get on Friday night when Florida State takes the field.
Yep.
I have a lot less confidence in what Florida's going to be. Not that they can't be really good on any given day, but I don't know. I've got a pretty good feel on Florida State, but not on the Gators.
Yeah, Mark, that is the storyline of the game. Florida State's going to come in. They're going to run the ball well. Jordan Travis is going to probably play a good game, maybe excellent game, because we don't know what we're getting from this Florida defense. But if Florida's defense plays anywhere like they did Texas A&M, South Carolina, Florida State can still win the game. Don't get me wrong, but it'll be a really good game if that's the Florida State we get and the Florida we get. But if you get the USF game, Florida, or the Kentucky game, Florida, or the Vanderbilt game, Florida State's going to blow Florida out, and it won't even be a game because some of the things they do well on offense, especially running the ball to the edge, using some counters, that has hurt Florida's defense a lot at times this year. They did have that, as I said, 6-game stretch where Texas A&M, South Carolina did not score a point on them. But especially on offense for Florida too, Mark, what you could rely on. You could rely on Florida to run the ball. They got manhandled by Vanderbilt last week. Florida couldn't run the ball at all on one of the worst defenses in the country, and that was a complete surprise there. Anthony Richardson goes and throws for 400 yards, but some of that was chunk yardage, and he missed some throws on third downs, missed some easy downfield throws as well, and barely ran the ball. And look, you go back and look at Florida's wins this year, Mark, and go look at how many yards Florida ran for. And 210 yards seemed to be that mark. If Florida hits 210, they win. If they don't hit 210, they lose. That's the kind of magic number there. And I don't think that's, I don't think it's that much. Florida gets anywhere around 200 yards this game, okay, they're going to be in the game. And Mark, I'll go ahead and say, they may have to. Florida's batting a lot of injuries at wide receiver right now. We don't know the status of Justin Shorter. I think he'll play, but he's not 100%. Xavier Henderson, very questionable this game. Ricky Pearsall, I'm saying questionable to doubtful this game. Marcus Burke, maybe not, may not play as well. Florida's dealing with a lot of injuries, going to have to rely on some young guys. But I'm also going to say, Mark, it might be a blessing in disguise. Florida may not be able to abandon the run game because they may have to run the ball, and they may have to get Anthony Richardson involved in the run game. But even with that, Mark, you're right. We don't know what Florida we're going to get because you saw the worst of it last week when everything seemed to be going right. It seemed they were turning a corner only to go lay an egg.
Florida State, Doe Campbell on Friday night. We got David Waters from Gators Breakdown right here. Check it out on YouTube, Gators Breakdown, or on your favorite audio platform. You mentioned recruiting. So you mentioned Mike Norvell. He has not recruited well in the state of Florida. He's gone elsewhere to get some of his better players. Billy Napier had a pretty good offseason run for the most part in recruiting and made some strides. How big is this game in the recruiting process? I'll take it from these two angles. Overall, like last 5 years, how important's it been? And then how important do you think it is right now?
That's a good question, Mark, because Florida ran the state for a little while under Dan Mullen, and it didn't really amount to much of going and dominating in-state recruiting in the state of Florida. And look, that was one reason Florida decided to move on. Now, there's been some recruiting battles this year between the two schools, and one big target, Roderick Kearney, over the summer, committed to Florida State. Florida flipped him, late October. Big-time offensive lineman from here in Orange Park, right down the road from here where I am in Jacksonville. And now another offensive lineman target, Lucas Simmons. He recently visited Florida for the South Carolina game a couple of weeks ago. Florida may give you some things to think about. I think when it's all said and done, he probably sticks with his commitment to Florida State, but there's another one right there. But there doesn't seem to be those Dalvin Cook battles. If you go back to that battle and everybody thinking he's going to Florida, it's a high profile recruitment, and he goes to FSU and spurns the Gators at the end. You're not getting those type of battles. Florida's in those type of big battles with Georgia and Alabama. They're not in those top in Miami now, and they're not in those type of big battles with Florida State, and that's still holding true right now. So yeah, Mark. Mike Norvell in his third year, like I said, I don't know how far a win versus Florida would take recruiting in the next month going into early signing day. Most of the time, that really doesn't make a difference when it's all said and done. And there's not, like I said, there's not too many targets they're really fighting over right now where I think a win would push one way or the other. Lucas Simmons might be the only one I'm bringing up there along the offensive line. So, but either way, I still think, especially looking at Florida, maybe even Miami, both teams, while they're in the top 10, can still do a better job of recruiting the in-state elites and not letting them get away from in-state. But Alabama, Ohio State, Georgia, they're not worried about Florida State doing that. They are more worried about Florida and Miami doing it. But right now, they're not worried about Florida State keeping that top in-state of Florida talent.
So connected to that topic, going back as far as I've been watching college football, which is further than I'd like to admit, the 80s and the 90s were pretty much, there could be an argument that college football stopped and started in the state of Florida between those three schools. And sometimes all three of them were near top 5 status, usually 2 out of the 3 up until about 10 years ago. And now we've come to a place now that Florida State dropped off after Jimbo left, where it's kind of like none of them are, and it's almost like, as I try to gauge it, whether it's in the off season based on recruiting usually, or during the season, obviously based on the results on the field, I'd say for the last 5 years, it's been like month to month, who seems to be having the momentum and where the surge seems to be. For a while, it seems to be Miami. Then it seems to be Florida. Obviously, it was Dan Mullen for his first few years. It was like, okay, well, this is Florida's. Now it seems maybe it's Florida State. Like it's nobody is taking that thing over, and it seems to change month to month as to who has the best trajectory going forward.
Yeah, Mark, and even for Florida State, and this is not to down them at all, but do we think what they're doing is sustainable? Right now, like, will this push into next year? I mean, I don't know. I'm not saying it won't, but I can't sit here and write with a pen and a permanent marker saying that it's going to be. They're relying on a lot of transfers this year. That's the world of college football right now. Can you replicate that year after year? I'm not saying they can't, not saying they won't, but Florida, even in early in Dan Mullen's tenure, had a lot of success through the transfer portal, and it went a long way. And you had your Van Jeffersons and your Trevon Grimes and your Jonathan Grenards, guys who came in and really made a difference, but it wasn't sustainable. I still think your best path is kind of like they say in the NFL, but your best path in college football is first recruiting high school athletes and making sure those guys are your key contributors. And the transfer portal, is a lot like the NFL free agency. You go fill in your gaps there, and then that can make the difference. I'm not sure you can rely on it year in and year out. Team chemistry, all that comes into play. You know, a lot of people say that with the NFL too. You build your team in the draft and you supplement through free agency. I still think we're so early in the transfer portal. Some teams might be able to do that. I'm not sure, but if you're looking at Florida State, I don't what they're doing, is that sustainable next year? And some of these transfers not being on their team next year, Florida's going to have a mass exodus when this season's over with. Of guys transferring out, and then probably a mass exodus coming into transfer portal, while Billy Napier manages his roster early on as well with a good recruiting class. Miami, good recruiting class at the same time. They'll be relying on the portal as well. So, Mark, it might be, how sustainable is what Florida State's doing, and how fast can the young guys for Florida State or for Florida and Miami contribute?
David, you should know me well enough to know I'm going to ask this. A lot of people are going to watch Florida State for the first time, just because those teams have not been in the playoff mix. A lot of people out there just watch their team and watch the best games, but this is showcased on a Friday night. So a lot of newcomers, a lot of new viewers. So give us a couple Gators to look out for.
Yeah, especially if you're on the Florida State side and you haven't watched Florida. You're going to know the name Etienne because of his brother at Clemson. So, Trevor Etienne, the brother of Travis Etienne at Clemson, definitely watch out for him, especially, as I said, if Florida's going to have to rely on running the ball, if they've got some injuries at the wide receiver position there. So I think Trevor Etienne's the name at the running back position you definitely watch out for. Montrell Johnson, the other main running back for the Gators, transferring from Louisiana to Florida. And look, they've been a great 1-2 punch for the Gators so far this year. Like I said, you go back to last week, you won't see it versus Vanderbilt. But if you want a holistic look, throw that game out the window. Those guys have gotten it done game in and game out for the Gators. Offensive line, you look at Osiris Torrance, one of the best offensive linemen in the country. He's going to be a day 1, day 2 pick in the NFL draft coming up. And on defense, Brenton Cox, the 5-star transfer from Georgia, got dismissed about a month ago. And you've had some young guys, Antoine Powell-Ryland step up and play really well in Brenton Cox's absence of this team, and also Princely Uman-Mielen there as far as the edge goes for Florida on the defensive line. And those guys going to have a lot on their plate, Mark, as I mentioned earlier, with this FSU run game and how much they run the counter and how much they want to get outside sometimes and run around the edge with their running backs. And those two guys I just named on defense are going to have their hands full. They're going to have to play discipline. They're going to have to set the edge. They're going to have to make tackles that they missed last week. And so those are the guys that I think, Mark, the guys I named there, I think you should really key on both sides of the ball for the Gators.
The only stat I wrote down from the Vandy game, I couldn't believe it, 2.1 yards per carry, as you said.
Florida was averaging, Mark, about 6 yards a carry. They were one of the country's best as far as that goes. They didn't get Richardson involved enough with his legs, either design runs, whether he didn't want to run, whether enough 50-50, zone read decisions where he probably should just be more aggressive and keep the ball at times. But, Mark, I think when you get to that point, you get a slow start in the run game. It doesn't look like it's there. I think Florida came out the second half, and Anthony Richardson ran the first 2 plays. You could tell it was, all right, we're going to run you coming out of the locker room. Why couldn't that have been done, on the sideline and getting prep for another drive? Why couldn't that go earlier in the game? Why did it take that long to make that adjustment? We know the type of weapon he can be with his legs. Florida can't wait that long to really get him going. And, he helps the running backs. He helps the offensive line as well. And, Mark, on that note, while we're on this game, hey, look, this is probably the last time we see Anthony Richardson playing in a game for the Gators. I know up and down performance this year, but NFL drafts analysts and scouts still put that first round grade on him a whole lot. I don't see it. I think it benefited him a whole lot if he came back, played another year. If the NFL team's going to draft him, you're not drafting him to play next year. You better be drafting him to sit on the bench for 2 years and learn as much as he can. He is not an instant plug-and-play guy at the quarterback position. He's got so much to learn. Hey, but look, if you're a first-round, you're getting those picks, you're getting that draft grade, you're throwing $30 million in my face, I'll probably not turn it down either. But, just on the football aspect of it, Mark, it's all potential.
Absolutely. Good stuff here. David Waters, Gators Breakdown. You got to lock it in right here on YouTube or your favorite audio platform. David, happy Thanksgiving. Enjoy the game. We'll be watching, and we'll see you soon.
Have a good one too, Mark. Thanks.